So, what's the first thing that comes to mind when someone says cassette? Well, interestingly, depending on where you're from and what things are called in your language, you might be thinking of a number of things. For example, a cassette in some languages can refer to a cartridge, like that used in some video game systems. But the most likely use case for that word is something that holds tape within, and if you're the same age as me, you're probably thinking about something along the lines of a VHS, or of course an audio tape, a compact cassette. And in the 90s, growing up, I mostly remember listening to cassette tapes in a car because we wouldn't get a car with a CD player in it until the early 2000s. And also in boomboxes. For example, I have weird early memories of listening to bedtime stories on these guys.
Wiesztia. Oczy majczycy, gdzie jeste? Pomozite!
Oh yeah, that's what makes you into a man here where I live. And I have actually used tapes in my car as late as 2013, 2014 because my car back then was one of these. And it only had a tape deck. Heck yeah. I've also used one of those cheap tape to 3.5mm adapters. And I can only say that my license plate was nice. Anyway, yeah, so for me, tapes were a media used for holding analog audio or video data, and it really wasn't until I started getting into collecting old technology some 15 years ago that I've learned that tape was indeed used for a variety of things. But the most fascinating use of audio cassette tapes, for me anyway, was to store data and interface with all computers. And I remember loading my first program on a C64 and being absolutely blown away. It was the same discovery as dropping the needle on a vinyl record when I first started using those and thinking, how the hell does that work? Where's the music coming from? And explaining how computers actually read analog data stored on a magnetic tape is not something I'll get into in this video, but whether it's an analog interface used by Sinclair, Tandy, and other companies, or a digital interface used, for example, by Commodore or Atari, the principle is the same, and it really doesn't matter what the source of the audio data is. There were many weird audio formats, ranging from reel to weird vinyl flexidiscs. But whatever the case might be, that method of exchanging data was primarily used in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, until eventually other, more advanced and efficient ways of storing data became more mainstream. First 5.25 and then 3.5-inch floppy disks, and then later things like CDs, DVDs, flash storage, external hard drives, external solid-state drives, and so on. But something that I didn't really know until quite recently is that various tape storage devices actually went on to be used throughout the 90s and are actually still in use to this day. They're primarily used in archival storage, since even though tape as a format was notorious for being slow and clunky, it's actually extremely reliable and apparently can last a long time. And just as a side note, I've spent 3 whole days recently helping my dad archive an unimaginable amount of CDs and DVDs that he used back in the day to store his photos, since he's a photographer. And yeah, kids nowadays may not realize that before you could just buy terabytes upon terabytes of hard drives or solid state drives, people had to store those things away on magnetic or optical media. And you can see that I made good use of my Apple collection. At one point I had like 6 computers out, all working simultaneously, downloading files off of those CDs and DVDs. And contrary to popular belief, even though these were burned discs and they weren't even stored that well, my estimate is that over 90% of them ended up reading just fine, and out of the 10% that had issues reading, I'd say around 5% weren't burned properly. So yeah, I had very good luck with optical media, and I do remember vividly using CDs and then later DVDs to store the things I had to move for my hard drive, because at one point I had a 10 gig hard drive, I think. So to have a device all the way back in the 90s that could have stored gigabytes upon gigabytes of data on a tape that's almost half the size of a regular audio tape, I mean, that would have been extremely appealing if you had a lot of files to store and transfer. And to be honest, during that time there were dozens of proprietary tape backup systems by dozens of companies. I mean, My Omegas, Ditto drives, OnStreams, ADR tape, Exabytes, Data 8. DLT and LTO tapes, Traven, AIT, and so on. And the reason why there are so many primarily enterprise solutions is because unlike consumer media, like floppies or CDs, they didn't have to be compatible with a vast variety of players and other hardware, since you or your company were the only ones using these things for backup. And I really didn't have any first-hand experiences with any of these backup formats, but then I saw a player and a tape being offered on a local auction, and I thought, man, that'd be cool to try out, and I also thought it would make for an interesting video, so I bid on it, and here it is. It's a DDS cartridge, which stands for Digital Data Storage, and when I first saw it, I thought it looked strikingly similar to a mini DV tape I used to use in camcorders in early 2000s. But what it actually is, it's a format based on DAT, a digital audio tape, which was a format developed by Sony and introduced in 1987. And much like audio cassette tapes, these things were later repurposed for other things, including data storage. It's a fascinating format, and the reason it sort of failed is a topic I'm not getting into, but if you're interested in that, go watch Tecmo's episode on it. Not sure why you haven't watched it already. And needless to say, I never had a DAT cassette in my life, so this was my introduction to it. And it looks very neat, along with that player, which was branded as a Dell, but looking up the model, I'm pretty sure this one was made by Seagate, and as we'll see, it bore the name Scorpio. Wicked. So doing a bit of research, this DDS format was introduced shortly after the DAT itself. The first iteration, the DDS1, came out in 1989, and it could hold up to 4 gigs of compressed data, which, if you know anything about hard drive sizes around that time, was absolutely astronomical. The tape I have here is a DDS3, so a third generation, and it could hold up to 24 gigabytes, which was even more impressive. And the drives were somewhat backwards compatible. For example, my Scorpio here can read both the DDS4, 3, 2, and 1 tapes. I was curious to see how much did these things cost back in the 90s, and looking up some old ads in contemporary magazines, I could see that you could have gotten a DDS2 drive along with a tape and software for around $800 to $1,000, or a DDS3 drive for around double that price, which actually didn't sound too bad, since at that time a 1.6 gig hard drive could set you back around $200. So it would make sense to splurge for a drive and then just buy the cartridges, and one article I found said you could have gotten a box of 5 to 12 gig carts for around $200, which again seems like a pretty good value for money to me. And if you used these things back in the day, please write in the comments how much were you spending on the tapes and the drives. Later models like the DAT 320 released around 2009 worked quite a bit differently and could hold up to 320 gigs but weren't compatible with the previous generations. The drives came in various interfaces, later ones using USB, but since mine was an older model, it used SCSI. Now I got these things from an auction and I really had no idea as to the condition they were in, but the drive itself looked to be in good shape and the tape was used and it had Mario written on it, so I was kinda curious if I'd find anything on there. So I thought about which computer I should use to test this backup system on, and given how the tape I wanted to test was released around 96, I wanted to use an era-appropriate hardware. So after a quick trip to my computer-infested shed, I schlepped up this gorgeous Pentium 133 system made by Siemens. And well, it's at least beautiful to me, even though it's in quite a rough shape. I've got this thing who knows when, and the reason why I chose it, well, it was close to the top of my hardware pile, and also I just wanted to test it out since I haven't gotten around to doing that yet. It's a Pentium 133 system with 32 megs of RAM, and it had all the components inside, including a 2 gig hard drive, which again should give you some insight in just how much storage 24 gigs was at the time. Opening it up, holy nuts, I was blown away by the amount of dust and grime inside that case, which is fascinating. I mean, how did it get that way with the lid closed? Anyway, I started brushing some of that stuff off with a brush dipped in alcohol, but it just had to be blown out, so I took some compressed air and blew out some of these dust bunnies off camera. That made a huge improvement, but I still gave it a good clean with a brush and some alcohol. I also did my best to clean the external parts, including the plastic front panel and the metal cover, which had some stubborn marks on it, which I was able to get off just by using some alcohol and sponge in combination with lots of hard scrubbing. And after it was all nice and cleaned, it was time to test it out. So I got out my little Samsung SyncMaster I usually use for testing purposes, and some era-appropriate peripherals, including my trusty IBM Model M keyboard, an old PS2 ball mouse, and some beige yellow speakers. And I was very happy not only to see this thing post, but it booted straight to Windows 95, which, I mean, a working 30-year-old spinning Rust hard drive with a working installation of Windows is like winning the lottery ticket in my book. And it meant I wouldn't have to go through the whole Windows and drivers installation process, which was awesome. And this installation was super clean too, which was great. It looked like factory original. And there are many things I love about these old systems. For example, they make for a great DOS gaming machine, if you're into that, and just the overall vibe and the form factor, and the fact that it has a key lock, which I always wondered about as a kid. Like, what the heck do you need that for on a computer? And the fact that I understand these things now is just kinda satisfying, like I'm solving mysteries from my childhood. Anyway, after making sure it was all working, it was time to start setting up our tape backup solution, and yeah, we have to install a SCSI controller card of some kind, and I had this Adaptec PCI card laying around, which I wanted to use for this project. And after digging it out from my storage, I started looking at it, and I was like, wait, something's off. The connector on this guy just seemed weird, and that's because it's not the regular PCI. Comparing it to a regular PCI card, you can see that this one has an additional section here, and that's actually meant to go in a PCI X slot, which is a longer 64-bit variant and supports higher bandwidths. It was used mainly on servers and workstations, and I was like, nuts, I don't have a motherboard I can stick this thing into. But after doing a bit of reading, I realized that you can actually use the majority of these cards and this Adaptec 29160 in a regular PCI slot with that extra bit sticking out, and it should run fine, albeit it won't support the higher speeds of the PCI extended bus. So I proceeded to install it in one of the free PCI slots, which this horizontal desktop has a riser card with one 16-bit ISA and 3 PCI slots, which is pretty cool since it gives you that legacy ISA bus for earlier graphics and sound cards. Unfortunately, this computer didn't have any spare 5¼ drive bays for me to install the tape drive into, so I just improvised and left the top open. Now, one thing to note with pretty much all these tape drives is that they not only need an appropriate hardware interface, you also had to use special software to get data on and off those tapes. The drive doesn't just show up under a drive letter like floppy or CD drives, and you have to use dedicated programs that can recognize and interface with your device. So that was kind of the third part of the puzzle, and I was really concerned because doing the initial research, hunting around various forums, people were saying that you had to run special scripts through NT or Windows Server or Linux, and I just didn't really know how to go about doing any of that. But then thankfully I found this video of a guy replacing a very similar Quantum DDS drive, and in that video he was using this enterprise piece of software called Backup Exec. And yeah, it looked very user-friendly, so I started looking and I found a Win9598 NT compatible version on archive.org, so I've decided to try that. And it actually installed without a hitch, and yeah, it seemed to be working very well, as it had options to either back up the contents of your hard drive to the tape, or restore the backup on the tape to your hard drive. Not surprisingly, it showed there was no device to back up to or from, which was expected since I didn't install any drivers or configured the SCSI card in any way. And looking it up in the device manager, I could see the SCSI controller was present, and it was also popping up in the BIOS screen, so it was detected by the system. And I have already found some Win95 drivers, and I've burned them to a CD, which, yeah, both the floppy drive and the CD drive were working fine, which was awesome. But after updating the driver in the device manager, yeah, I still got that freaking yellow exclamation mark, the bane of my bloody existence. Now here's the thing, for all the young kids watching, if you ever had that moment with your computer where you're trying to hook up a peripheral via USB or something and it's not working and you're like, this stupid thing drives me insane, Yeah, you don't know what pain is, man. And I've heard this countless times, again, mostly from people who didn't have much experience with system like this, and they would say, oh, the retro computers are so much better, it was all way better back in the day. And man, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Like, just take a 486 or an earlier Pentium machine and try connecting a printer to it. I dare you. I mean, serial and parallel connections sucked enough as it is, but with SCSI there are so many additional things to worry about. You have to make sure to have the connection terminated, and also to set the termination parameters in the SCSI configuration utility, and also to make sure your SCSI card isn't conflicting with anything else. So if you have a video or a network card like I do, you have to check all the FNR, Q, and DMA settings and to define a proper controller ID. You might also have to change some jumper settings on your drive while you're at it, and if that isn't enough, you have a couple of dip switches on the motherboard which determine a whole slew of hardware options for your peripherals. So I had to refer to the Adaptec manual like a sucker, making sure to set everything up right, and even after trying out everything alongside a couple of sets of drivers, the damn SCSI card just wouldn't work right. The tape drive seemed to be working okay with power hooked up, but it never showed up in that software, and the SCSI card still didn't work properly according to the device manager. And I've also tried removing the networking card in case it was conflicting, and also swapping out the order in which the cards were installed, and a whole bunch of other things, but before I could even finish troubleshooting this thing, it started having some hardware issues, and it wouldn't post anymore. I love old computers. But I already figured out I would probably need to get another system, so I reluctantly lugged another beige hog from my basement shed. Okay, so take two. And in fact more like take three because I had a different XP machine out, but it turns out it had a problem with a power supply, so it wouldn't turn on. So I have this other one. This is a Pentium 4 XP machine, and it has successfully booted into the operating system, which is great because that means I don't have to spend any time installing it and fiddling with the video drivers and all that. And this thing also has a couple of available PCI slots, so we're gonna try sticking that SCSI card in and seeing whether or not we get a better result. If nothing else, this thing actually has USB on board, so it's going to be way easier moving driver files around, hopefully. We'll see. And I've proceeded to install the SCSI card into one of the slots, and again, I've just temporarily hooked up the tape drive just to see if it would work at all. And I thought I would have to find an updated version of that backup exec software since I didn't think it would work on XP, but I wanted to try it out just because, and by golly, it not only installed fine, but it seemed to be working very well. And the SCSI card was recognized by the system immediately, but so was the case for the previous machine. I still needed to get it working, and for that I found some Adaptec XP drivers and installed them. And to my amazement, after rebooting, the card seemed to be working fine. There were no errors according to the device manager. So I anxiously powered up the software, and I was amazed to see that instead of the previous no device found error, the thing actually recognized the tape drive and prompted me with a message to insert a cartridge. Okay, so the setup has actually recognized the tape drive. So that's awesome. That means that the SCSI controller is working and that there are no conflicts. Man, I guess we'll stick the tape in and we'll try seeing if there's anything on there. Awesome. So I put the cassette in and I was curious to see whether we'd find anything on it. And the drive started making noises and the software was clearly detecting it, but eventually threw up an error about the tape not being initialized. And to be honest, that wasn't a huge surprise. You see, there are many numerous pieces of software and methods of getting data on the tape, and there was really no way of knowing what program or which version of the program the previous owner used. And every software has its own encryption, compression, and detection methods, so it's very likely I just didn't have the exact same software the previous owner used to back up his data with, assuming there was something on the tape. But I still wanted to see this thing in action, so I've decided to do my own backup, and I've proceeded to initialize the tape and to back up a couple of folders just to test it out. And seeing that thing work after all the hassle, Man, it was pretty satisfying, and even though we didn't use the PCI Extreme interface, it seemed to be going at a decent bitrate, especially for 1996 when this thing was introduced. It took around 10 minutes to back up around 2 gigs of files, and afterwards I did another smaller session, and I was able to successfully retrieve all the files from the tape. And I mean, this hardware is like 30 years old, and again is a testament to how reliable tape storage and the drives can be. And I really did learn a lot doing this project, not only about tape backup systems, but hardware in general. And apart from some mishaps along the way and the mess that I've made, as per usual, this was a great project, and I'd like to learn more about weird backup media and drives. Oh, and since everything seemed to be working fine, and this Pentium 4 box actually had some spare 5¼ inch drive bays, I've decided to install this drive into the case more permanently. And this thing has one of those annoying metal cages underneath the plastic cover, and you have to break off that section, which sucks ass and it's dumb. But I've managed to do it, and I guess it would make more sense to install this in a black case or to have a beige front panel, but I really don't care too much. I'm just happy all of this works properly now. And it even works with a thing flipped on its side, like a tower. Heck yeah. So if I want, I can do enterprise-style tape backup in the future, which is dope. I might back up my whole video catalog, since you can actually still find new old stock tapes pretty cheaply. And if you'd like to see more videos on backup formats, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video format of me exploring old crap, you might want to consider subscribing. I do videos like this every week. Retrospective repairs, restorations, reviews, all sorts of tech stuff. And if you appreciate what I do, you can help me out a little by joining my Patreon. You'll have early access to my videos, and I already have 1 or 2 up there. And if you'd like to chat about stuff and hang out with geeks like me, you can join our Discord server. All the links will be in the video description. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.